Yes. Good afternoon to everyone. I now open hearing number 11 of the 188th period of sessions of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is entitled, this hearing, Follow-up of Precautionary Measures for Beneficiaries of Deprived of Liberty in Cuba. And this is an ex officio hearing. My name is Roberta Clark, and I am the second Vice President and the Rapporteur for LGBTI persons, the rights of LGBTI persons, and I am accompanied in this hearing by Julissa Mantia, who is the Rapporteur for the rights of women, but also for memory, truth, and justice, Rapporteur for memory, truth, and justice. And also present at the hearing is Fernanda Dos Anjos, who is coordinator of the precautionary measures and our chief expert at this hearing. I begin with cordial greetings to civil society. The object of this hearing is follow-up on the implementation of 10 precautionary measures granted for the protection of human rights defenders and or opposition members deprived of their freedom and liberty in Cuba, and to receive updated information from you on their risk situation. Now, I just wanted to say for clarity that there are 46 precautionary measures in force currently, Fernanda, in Cuba, but this hearing concerns 10 precautionary measures because we are only focused now on persons deprived of liberty. And at our last count, those 10 precautionary measures covered 17 people deprived of liberty. And I just want to just for the record, just mention what 10 precautionary measures that to which we will give attention today. So the first one is 484 of 11, Jose Daniel Ferrer Garcia, then 242 of 2013? 13. Yes. And this is Ladies in White, and there's 7 women who are covered by this precautionary measure: Aymara Nieto Munez, Sisi Zamora, Jacqueline Morales, Tania Menendez, Celi Alvarez, Berta Fernandez, and Leticia Herrera, the Ladies in White. Then we have 306 of 19, Josiel Guide, 307-19, Ivan Hidalgo, 208 of 20, Yandier Labrada, 111-01 of 20, and these are identified members of the San Isidro movement, Luis Alcantara and Miquel Perez. We have the number 7 precautionary measure, 30 of 21, Luis Liza Tigui. Yes. 768 of 21, Feliz Rodriguez, and then we have 46-22 as well as 146-22, Walnie Rivera and Ibrahim Aguilar. So these are the precautionary measures that we will be paying attention to. I just want to explain how we will run the time, and we do have time, so I think we can be calm about that. The representatives of the persons who are beneficiaries of precautionary measures, you will have 45 minutes in the first instance. So a little bit more than we indicated to you, but we understand that you have a film that you want to show? Yes? So just be calm and take your time because you have the time to also show the film. And then we will take 15 minutes instead of 30 minutes because we are only 2 commissioners. Ordinarily, we might be 3 or 4, but there are only 2 of us now, so we don't need 30 minutes. So we will take 15 between us, 3 of us, and then comments, another 25 minutes from you, and then we close, and that will be how we will run this hearing. So with that, civil society, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Madam President, Commissioner Julissa, Chief Dos Santos. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to us and to pay attention to those that are in jail and that also have precautionary measures. Yo quisiera comenzar hablando sobre.
I'd like to start by talking about one political prisoner that doesn't have a precautionary measure, but who's at risk of death at this very time. So I'm going to devote 30 seconds to talk to you about Javier Delgado. Javier Delgado is 53. He's missing an arm. He's one of the prisoners who was convicted after the July 11th event. I'm going to read what a message that was written by his daughter. He has a heart condition that's very severe. His daughter, Adriana, says since the 4th of this month, he stopped taking his medication to protest the decision of the court and the judge and the prison personnel. They've insisted that he take it, and he says say he's very ill, and he said he wouldn't because the court said he has to be in prison and he's going to leave his life in the hands of God. And he said he's been hit and beaten black and blue. He says that the doctor said they were going to examine him for weeks and they haven't done so yet. Please send spread this information around. This is the reality of the more than 1,000 political prisoners in Cuba. Just a few of them have precautionary measures granted. We call on the voice of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights to raise up and to provide, to lift, we'd like for you to focus on this video. Sonia is the mom of Sailina Navarro, one of the political prisoners as well, a member of the Damas de Blanco, the ladies in white. And she's talking about her Felix Navarro, her husband, who's been sentenced to 9 years in prison for leaving the police station to defend those who were disappeared on the July 11th in the protests. There's no Felix Navarro, his wife, and they are in jail. They're in the jail in the province of Matanzas, and then there's a man named Ferri, and that's why I'm talking to you, who's 70 some odd years old, and he has an injury. And he was injured in prison, and it's left him sequelae in his lungs, and he has hypoglycemia, and he's been taken to the infirmary, and we're very concerned about what can happen to him in the prison, because he denounced a lieutenant colonel who runs the prison. Also, there are no human rights of the prisoners or of the citizens of Cuba either. And it's the worst place in the hemisphere to be in prison. Now I'd like to introduce you to Ms. Ferrer, who's the daughter of José Añor Ferrer, who has a precautionary measure for years. It's been repeatedly, he's been in since 2021, July 11th, has been in a prisoner. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for allowing me to come here. My name is Marta Beatriz Ferrero. I'm the daughter of José Luis Ferrer Garcia, the general coordinator of the Patriotic Union of Cuba and the promoter of Cuba Decir. My father is a beneficiary of a precautionary measure that was granted by this commission, who we say is urgently needed. And today in Cuba, the figures are more than 1,000, including men and women of prisoners, political prisoners, who are courage, and they have to undergo physical and psychological torture, infrahuman conditions they endure, only because they aspire to have a free and democratic nation. My father is one of these courageous men who survives in inhuman conditions in an isolation cell that's designed to break his spirit, and under the eyes of the world, and under the vigilance of the dictator's guards. He fights every day against plagues and insects and mosquitoes. And Jose Daniel Ferrer has been subjected to forced disappearance on several occasions. The last one lasted for months. Over that time, he received insufficient food in prison, surviving with the little bit of food that the family was able to hand over to him. He's had many different diseases because of the lack of adequate medical care and timely medical care. And on October 30th, and Luis Martea Artaigo was able to see my father for 15 minutes after about 5 months of seeing nobody. The Castro Carnel communist regime did not say that give any proof that he was alive under physical torture and psychological torture and amidst mosquitoes who eat him alive. He has permanent headaches now, and he has cramps in his hands. He will not give in to the impositions of tyranny. We call on this commission desperately and the international community to intervene effectively. We call for the immediate release of my father and all political prisoners, and to cease the repression against everyone who struggles for a free Cuba. We call for the decisive point of the ICHR to ensure the security and respect for the human rights of these men and women who are unjustly in jail. Good afternoon. My name is Giovanna Villegas. I'm representing the Institute of Race, Equality, and Human Rights, the petitioners of precautionary measures 26413 and 106820, where 8 people remain deprived arbitrarily of freedom for political reasons. 7 from the Damas de Blanco, an organization in 2003, demonstrated in Sunday on behalf of human rights, and a member of the Christian Liberation Movement, MCL, an organization also promotes democracy and respect for human rights in Cuba, which was founded in 1988 by Oswaldo Paya and other independent activists. Firstly, I will talk about the Damas de Blanco. The women that are made belong to this organization face ongoing risk of patterns of violence that are designed to intimidate and break up the organization. From January to September 2023, we've documented 395 short-term detentions, and thus far 7 beneficiaries are still deprived of liberty for political reasons. 7 in jails and others under house arrest. Tanya Echevarria, Menendez, and Sayele Navarro Alvarez have been detained since April 2022. The former convicted to 6 years in prison, the second to 8 years. They are being held in the Bellotex Center in Matanzas for participating in the protests on July 11th. And also, Cici Abascal Zamora, the youngest of the Damas de Blanco, is serving a sentence of 6 years. The authorities have denied her to change of her situation because of her negative attitude for not participating in pro-government actions. Aymara Nieto Munoz has been detained since May 4th, 2018. Despite serving her first sentence, she was prevented from being released, being accused of organizing a riot in the prison. She's now in minimum severity at the same prison. Jacqueline Heredia Morales was detained on June 3rd, 2023. She's in the Cuba Panama prison for HIV/AIDS patients for taking part in the Girasoles March in 2019, which was called to peacefully request the release of persons deprived of liberty for political reasons in Cuba. Recently, she has been threatened to not include on her list of visits any of the members of the Damas de Blanco. All of the beneficiaries are facing inadequate prison condition and the custody of the state. They suffer repression, constant harassment and discrimination for political reasons. They're also exposed to poor nutrition, a lack of access to drinkable water, and unhealthy spaces. The 5 Damas de Blanco were sentenced for ambiguous crimes And also there are members of the organizations Berta Soler Fernandez since July 2022 and Leticia Herreria since August 2022. They're both exposed selectively and arbitrarily. They've been put in jail for political reasons. The authorities have changed this precautionary measure and move her from prison to prison. Lastly, Yandier Garcia Labrada, a member of the MCL, was detained on October 6, 2020 for complaining for irregularities for provision of nutrition at the Manatee Supply Center, and she was sentenced to 5 years in prison. She's been the victim of mistreatment in communication and prolonged isolation. In 2022, she remained 3 months incommunicado in a punishment cell. Her health has deteriorated over the course of her deprivation of liberty because of lack of adequate medical treatment, despite chronic asthma, and she's also extremely skinny because of the lack of proper nutrition. Since January 2023, the beneficiary has been deprived of liberty in the correctional Guayabino 8 in Las Tunas. The jailers have denied her benefits of visits that she's entitled to. Because of the foregoing that will be explained in the final request, we call on the Commission to demand the release of persons arbitrarily deprived of liberty for political reasons, and we underscore that the suffering and threats that these people face has also been extended to their family members, as will be explained in the video that we will show next. The Castro regime has put into prison Aymara, my wife, torturing her. Even our family's been tortured. Aymara leaves one Sunday to demonstrate peacefully, and I was in jail on Sunday, and she was leaving. She was detained and put into the police station of Alamar, and Aymara leaves, and there's a police who provokes her and hits her, smacks her in front of people here, and it was peacefully at home, and then she leaves, and brutally she's beaten up. Aymara's taken to jail, and she's prosecuted and charged with assault and public disorder and several other ambiguous things. And with Aymara there, for 2 years she was in languishing in prison. She is implicated in a case in the prison for rioting, but it was the prison authorities who caused the riot to be able to force her to leave the Damas de Blanco and the Patriotic Union of Cuba party or group. And she never accepted doing this. The dictatorship of the Castro, together with the state security, punishes her and sentences her to 5 years of deprivation of liberty. In the prisons at this time, there's no food, there's no medications. There's cruel repression in them. And we, as family members, we are also going through a painful situation, because it's not easy to have a daughter sentenced for 6 years for public disorder and assault that she never committed, crimes she never committed. And I want to call on the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to raise its voice on behalf of the political prisoners, and to listen to the family members of the political prisoners, because in Cuba there are political prisoners. There's more than 1,000, and the Cuban regime, the dictatorship, shows an image that's not accurate. It provides inaccurate information. In Cuba, there's always political prisoners. Their rights are violated. And we, as citizens, we don't have rights either. I, as a member of the Dama de Blanco, my rights are violated for going to mass. I'm repressed. I'm fined. I'm threatened. Esteemed Commission members of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. My name is Larissa de Versen, Executive Director of Cuba Lex. Today, we are talking about the critical situation of human rights defenders, especially the members of the San Isidro movement. The response of the state to this movement has been to arrest and harass in an ongoing fashion the members and friends to the present day. After granting precautionary measure 1101 by this commission in February 2020, when the beneficiaries have had excessive surveillance, restrictions of movement, and groundless arrests. And Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara, Michael Castillo, and leaders of MSI, particularly since 2019, Otero Alcántara has faced a battle against state repression who have tried to silence him and his cultural influence. He's been punished with 5 years in prison in deplorable conditions and without medications, adequate medications, and they haven't been able to break his spirit. And Michael Castillo Perez, who's known as Michael Osorbo, has channeled his power of art, music, to denounce the injustices, facing implacable persecution and serious charges that threaten his freedom and his career. The repression is upsurged in 2020 when there's been extreme protests of hunger strikes in prison, despite the declarations of the UN who call the arrest as arbitrary. In 2022, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison, and today he has insufficient medical care. The situation of Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara and Michael is not unique. 16 other people have received precautionary measures. My colleague Claudio Ordóñez of Article 19 will speak further about this. Thank you very much. It's important to underscore to the members of the Commission that 3 of the beneficiaries of these missions, Omar Ruiz Urquiola, Ana María Rames González, and Carlos Manuel Álvarez, have their right to return to Cuba has been denied, despite their repeated attempts to use domestic legal remedies. The government has prohibited their entry into the country. These cases show the infringement of fundamental rights such as freedom of expression, personal security, and free movement. Omar Ruiz, a breast cancer patient, suffers from medical neglect in Cuba despite her clinical history, and this affects her treatment. In 2020, when she left Cuba and then had problems to renew her passport in 2022, attempts were made by her to return were blocked by the government. Despite using all legal remedies, she received evasive and indirect threats as responses, including the possibility for her family to lose property and intimidation of those who support her family. The 16 Cuban activists that are overseas express ongoing fear for their security and that of their loved ones. They fear retaliation if they go back to Cuba, this could leave them to be stateless or in jail, as the government of Cuba has warned them. That's why most advocate for maintaining the precautionary measures that have protected them from being prosecuted and jailed in Cuba. And after emigrating, some people experience risks and hunger when they crossed international borders without adequate documentation. Additionally, they've confronted hostilities in allied countries of Cuba like Mexico, Nicaragua, Russia, and Serbia. And this shows the international influence of Cuba and the additional dangers they face for these activists in exile. The 4 beneficiaries who are not in jail, only 2 of them continue in their activism despite facing serious threats. One, a woman who's the mother of 4 children, has been warned that she could lose the custody of her children and be expelled from her home. The other 2 have ceased their artistic and activities and activism in an attempt to protect their family from government retaliation. Nonetheless, one of these has been denied the possibility to leave the country as the authorities have reported to her. In conclusion, the reality that's faced by the members of the San Isidro movement and other Cuban activists is a constant and gross human rights violation. This pattern of repression, intimidation, and violence, state-sponsored violence from the Cuban government that range from arbitrary detention and denial of rights to return and freedom of movement is a lack of commitment of the government of Cuba towards democratic principles and fundamental rights that should be ensured for all citizens. Likewise, that it shows a pattern whereby they have dismantled local organizations and independent civil society. The details of the situation of each of the beneficiaries has been hashed out in the report that we will hand over to the Commission. We issue an appeal to the Commission to continue to pay attention to the situation in Cuba and to take concrete actions to protect the people under its jurisdiction, particularly those who have been forced into exile and live under the constant threat of retaliation for their courageous defense of liberty and justice. It's vital for the international community to recognize the resistance of these activists and legitimacy of their struggle. We urge the Inter-American Commission to continue with their essential work promoting the respect for human rights in Cuba and ensuring that those who fight for these rights don't do so in vain. We're grateful, deeply grateful for the support and international solidarity, and we reiterate our tireless commitment to human rights in Cuba. Thank you. Honorable members of the Commission and colleagues who join me and the public who's here, I'm sorry the Cuban state is not here, who had the ethical obligation to provide the explanations, the rigor of the gross violations that we are raising here. The Observatory on Human Rights in Cuba that represents the political prisoners, Ms. Aguilar Rivera, both were demonstrator from July 11th, and Ibrahim Domingos, who's been in for a year, sentenced to prison. We want to say that they continue in deplorable prison conditions, and the aggregating factor is that his psychological and physical health have become worse without receiving the proper professional care. We also should remember that this gentleman from Santiago de Cuba was on July 11th peacefully went out to demonstrate when a Dama del Fuego and he were assaulted by the political police, and then they were the targets of detentions. One of the most cruel and during these demonstrations, and you can see in the transcript what happened in the videos. With regard to Juan Aguilar, is one of the ones that reflects the unfair and wrongful and the treatment and injustice of those who are in jail. 1 year, at like 100 people who have been overwhelmed by this situation in the country took part on July 11th in 1 year in a poor neighborhood of Cuba, took part in the demonstration. He was only 21 years. On July 20th, he was arrested, and for 7 days, his family was unaware of his whereabouts. He was also charged with sedition, and 21 years of jail was his sentence. And then he appealed, and then it was reduced to 12 years. In 2014, Juan Newman had been diagnosed with intellectual incapacity. In 2017, he underwent exams, and it showed that he had organic problems that required medication. In 2018, he was found exempt from compulsory military service because of his conditions, his medical conditions. And so his substantive rights were ignored, rights to freedom of expression and to demonstrate, but the expert psychiatric and medical exams were not performed and had been requested by his family because of the background that he had. This refusal led to Juan Nir to be deprived of his right to an effective defense. As a result of this political process, the state convicted him to a sedition, and for everything that needs to prepare for a defense to a young man who was not even found eligible for military service. He's in a prison, in a module for common and dangerous prisoners, and with horrible nutrition and without his medical treatment. And then he was transferred as a retaliation against his father. And he has a wonderful father, great father, Ibrahim Juan and Roberto and Alexandra Gorgara and Cesar Adrian Delgado, Salina Barro, Samuel Puperom make it clear to us, leave no doubt, that there is harassment of them and their family. We annex to this submission, this explanation of this pattern, honorable members of the Commission. The Cuban state has at least 8 legal ways to release and free immediately these political prisoners. This does not repair the damage and suffering caused to them, but at least it enables them to be together with their family.
One has to see a dungeon as in Ilex. No child should suffer depression such as the child of Michael Mpuy. A grandmother should be able to give a kiss to their grandchildren, as in the case of the Perdomo brothers, but the lack of political liberty is what governs the Cuban authorities, leading them to not act correctly. I'd like to close out my remarks with an expression from the young person Ibrahim Dominguez, who posted this on social media on that historic civic and political date of July 11th. And I quote, "I have the responsibility to raise my voice for all of those who are suffering. Thank you very much." Good afternoon. I'm Javier Larrondo, President of Prisoners Defenders. First of all, I'd like to mention the structural violations of due process in Cuba that have been denounced as illegal by different United Nations mechanisms, and many by the ICHR itself, and which are common to all of the cases presented here today. First, absence of judicial protection in situations of deprivation of liberty. Police and prosecutors impose precautionary measures of imprisonment for indefinite periods without the presence of or the participation of courts. Second, there are no independent defense lawyers in Cuba, since the lawyers depend organically, hierarchically, and economically on the Ministry of Justice and act, of course, as prosecutors, but as soft prosecutors. Third, absolute legal dependence of the judges and courts on the political powers that be. Fourth, the witnesses are always accusing Communist Party officials that the only admissible expert evidence is from the Ministry of the Interior. Fifth, an endless range of fundamental rights are criminalized: freedom of expression, demonstration, or association, leaving or entering the country, privacy, and many others. Now, sixth, the types of crimes in the criminal code that have been used, due to their nature, breadth, severity, and indeterminate nature from a normative standpoint, allow for unlimited criminalization. This is the case of public disorder, disobedience, contempt, assault, resistance, sedition, instigation to criminal activity, or propagation of epidemic, among many others. And finally, seventh, military criminal proceedings are used against civilians, more than 100 in the wake of July 11th, or summary proceedings, but also regular proceedings, which are highly violative of rights, with the absence of effective defense, the right to contradiction, equality of arms, deprivation of documentary evidence by the accused, and in summary proceedings, verbal judgments for which there's no documentary record. Luis Robles Elizastegui has been in prison since December 4th, 2020, as the result of an arbitrary detention, as has been ruled by the United Nations. He suffered a precautionary measure of provisional imprisonment issued by the prosecution without judicial protection. He underwent a fabricated trial without any guarantees for the crimes of enemy propaganda and disobedience, and then sentenced to 5 years in prison. His crime was to raise a banner that said, freedom, no more repression, free Denis Solis, and walking peacefully in circles without uttering a single word. He was violently arrested, and everything was recorded in several unquestionable video recordings. He languishes in prison without having been transferred to a prison of lesser severity, as the General Director of Prisons ruled. He has been subjected to beating, solitary confinement, humiliation, use of inmates to harass and threaten him, and lack of medical treatment for a case of pneumonia, a severe allergic condition acquired in prison, and grade 4 hemorrhoids, the most serious. His entire family suffers persecution. His brother was imprisoned for a fabricated cause, and his mother had to leave her job due to harassment by state security. Ivan Amaro Hidalgo, whose detention was determined to be arbitrary by the United Nations, also has been deprived of liberty since August 13, 2016, serving a 3-year prison sentence for having committed false crimes of assault and contempt because he was wearing a T-shirt that had the words "down with you-know-who" and "democracy yes, dictatorship no." Later, he was also prosecuted for another false attack when in reality he was threatened, handcuffed, and dragged on the ground without offering any resistance. He was denied the benefit of a lesser penalty and suffered severe punishment in walled cells without water or lighting. He was denied treatment and medical care for a disabling head injury. On July 9th, 2023, his sentence was served, but the harassment against him and his family is widespread, also against his acquaintances. His brother suffered imprisonment. His son, Andy Amaro Cruz, was taken to prison under false accusations, mistreated, and is on parole, but horribly repressed. And he's asked me to publicly request a sponsor so that he could leave Cuba legally, because his family can no longer cope with the repression. Josiel Guia Piloto, whose detention the United Nations also considered to be arbitrary, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for the crimes of contempt and public disorder, with the sentence was to expire in 2021 due to the torture, humiliation, and beatings he received. He suffered a pneumothorax in his left lung. After his release from prison, he was persecuted, summoned, arrested, and constantly threatened by the state security service until he was imprisoned again for peacefully demonstrating for human rights together with other activists. Without judicial intervention, he was placed in pretrial detention and is still in this situation. I'd like to thank the Commission very much. Thank you. Good afternoon, distinguished commissioners. My name is Jose Rubio. I am part of Civil Rights Defenders, and next I will present the prayers for relief that the organizations and activists present here put to the illustrious commission. First, to issue a public pronouncement calling on the Cuban state to immediately release the persons who are beneficiaries of precautionary measures and of all persons who are in prison because they're political prisoners or prisoners of conscience, so that both them and their family members cease to be victims of limitations on their mobility and subjected to violence, harassment, or discrimination. Second, issue follow-up resolutions recognizing that arbitrary deprivation of liberty on political grounds puts the victims in a vulnerable situation that exposes them to serious violations of their human rights, and demand their immediate release in the same terms as the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has done in similar cases. Third, demand of the Cuban state that it carry out its obligations to respect, protect, and guarantee the rights to life, liberty, humane treatment, protection against arbitrary detention, freedom of thought and expression, freedom of association, and the judicial guarantees for its citizens, and in particular persons who have been protected by precautionary measures issued by the illustrious Commission. Fourth, include the information presented during this hearing in Chapter 4B of your 2023 annual report, emphasizing the physical and emotional deterioration of the persons who have been subject to arbitrary deprivation of liberty, who are beneficiaries of precautionary measures, and their family members. Fifth, urge the Cuban state to apply the minimum rules of the United Nations for the treatment of prisoners, as well as the principles and good practices on the protection of persons deprived of liberty in the Americas, especially as regards the prohibition on acts of torture and the guarantee of proper food, health care, visits, and communication with family members. Sixth, monitor the health conditions of persons arbitrarily deprived of liberty who are protected by the precautionary measures that have been analyzed here, and follow up on the situation of physical, emotional, and economic deterioration of the families, as well as the possible imposition of regulations, forced exile, and prohibitions on return in the event that they are released. Seventh, hold a special session of the OAS Permanent Council to present the situation of freedom of expression in Cuba, as well as violations of fundamental human rights, the situation of political prisoners, and extrajudicial executions that are the responsibility of the Cuban state and that have been documented by this commission, as is the case of Osvaldo Paya et al. And eighth, request of the Cuban government that the commission be able to carry out an on-site visit accompanied by an organization such as ICIR ICRC rather, in order to check out the prison conditions as well as note the situation of lack of protection that the family members have been facing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, representative of civil society. What I have to say was a wholly disheartening lamentation on the situation of persons deprived of liberty in Cuba and more generally on the situation in Cuba now. The Commission will have some response, and then we will come back to the civil society for further discussion. Commissioner Mancia.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to thank the members of civil society and those who are with us virtually, and also with the hope that some of the persons who you represent may be able to hear us. I know it's very difficult, but they should know that we are very much bearing them in mind. As Commissioner Clark said, we have heard with great concern the situation which is known about what's happening. And I wanted to make a couple of comments, and then I have a couple of specific questions. First of all, we recognize that on granting precautionary measures, we recognize the serious situation faced by the persons we're talking about today, but we also recognize that there's an impact on the family. Beyond the fact that there are no precautionary measures for the family members, what is clear is that there's a very serious impact on the family members. In this regard, we're also aware that you have the difficulties you have getting direct information, but I wanted to ask if you could talk about the specific situation of sexual violence, sexual harassment, the situation of gender violence that might be suffered by, say, the damas de blanco, the women in white, or ladies in white, but also the family members of the political prisoners. Oftentimes, the men are in prison, and they seek to get information, and there are major gender components in those circumstances beyond the general harm. Second, we have received, and your prayers for relief, and we've listened to it very clearly. The country rapporteur is Commissioner Ralón, but because of considerations of force majeure, he was not able to be here on this occasion, but we're always in communication, and of course the Commission will continue to accompany you with pronouncements that it has made throughout this period of time. I also want to express my profound respect for those who are suffering this and the organizations that are supporting them, that are working to give visibility to this situation. Sometimes we've been told at the Commission, well, but the situation in Cuba, well, but one has to keep insisting. And so the Inter-American Commission will continue accompanying you, will continue following up on the case, will continue asking for information, will continue making pronouncements, and continue discussing the situation in our annual report. So this and any other situation that you could describe for us, for it's not just the country rapporteur, the thematic rapporteurship on persons deprived of liberty, which is in the hands of Commissioner Ralón as well, but also looking at the situation of women. We have rapporteurship on women's rights. So how can we construct a narrative that can be known beyond what's happening in Cuba and beyond that general vision, the general overview? The situation of the prisons, the reasons for why people are detained, and what you were telling us about how these people are literally dying. It's not just that they are detained, which is a violation of the right to personal liberty, but Some are literally dying, and we are bearing witness to the situation of persons who are not likely to survive because of the conditions. And this is extremely serious, and it has to be denounced, and the Commission will continue doing so. Thank you, President.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Mantilla. Now I ask Fernanda to take the floor.
Muchísimas gracias, comisionada. Y antes que nada,
Thank you very much, Commissioner. First of all, I'd like to thank you, the representatives of various precautionary measures who were able to come to this working meeting and share the testimony of family members, the situation that the beneficiaries of precautionary measures are facing, those who are detained in, we understand, different prisons or detention facilities in Cuba. You've mentioned the health situation of many of them, challenges when it comes to gaining access to adequate food and water. If you could provide a little more information that would allow us to understand how access to judicial remedies works, that is to say, in respect of these health situations. Are there effective remedies in Cuba? Can family members visit them, or are they in communication with them? Can they bring food and medicine, or is that not allowed? If you could provide us a little more information about the health situation, the situation of access to food and water, then we'd be most grateful. This would enable us to better understand the situation that the beneficiaries of the precautionary measures are undergoing at this time. You've also mentioned, as Commissioner Mantilla mentioned, threats to family members, harassment of family members of those who are deprived of liberty. If you could describe in a bit more detail the situation being faced by the family members, then we would also be most grateful. And we also want to understand if there's any differentiation among these different detention centers where they're found. Is there a differentiated situation with respect to persons deprived of liberty and beneficiaries of precautionary measures generally? In other words, do they face different threats because they are beneficiaries of precautionary measures, or because they are prominent persons who critique the regime? Is there a treatment that is different from other persons being held detained at these different centers? Finally, I'd be most grateful for all of the information. I'm grateful for all the information that you send to go into the record of the precautionary measures. This helps the Commission grasp the current point of implementation of the measures. What are the challenges that the beneficiaries are facing? So, indeed, so that the Commission can weigh whether to draw on other mechanisms. For example, the Commission decided to convene this hearing at its own initiative. We understand that you have a difficult situation when it comes to getting information from Cuba, but here I'd also like to thank you for any information that you can forward to us for the record, because it's very important for us to adequately follow up on this set of precautionary measures granted by the Commission with respect to different persons in Cuba. Thank you very much, Vice President.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. Thank you. I have quite a few questions already. I just want to start off by saying I join the regret that the state of Cuba is not here today to respond to what is happening in Cuba and your perspectives and your experiences. As you know, as we all know, the Commission, Cuba is in Chapter 4B of the Commission's annual report for a number of reasons, but including that it has committed massive, serious, and widespread violations, but also because there's been a discriminatory access to or abusive exercise of power that undermines the rule of law. And then there's also the question of the breach of the requirements of a democracy. A lot of what you've said here today highlights some of these or reinforces the evidence behind the decision for Cuba to be in Chapter 4B of the annual report. You speak of the criminalization, really, of social protests, and that's the denial of all of the fundamental freedoms that are so important for democracy. However, and I think that, democracy has to, in whatever political system you're in, democracy has to be accompanied by freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of conscience and belief. And these are issues that are very alive today in Cuba. I want to ask a question. So we know that a lot of people have been criminalized and imprisoned for social protests and for political thought and political opinion. I want to ask a little bit about the judicial process, the convictions. If you can just sort of share with me, I'm sure the other commissioners know, and Fernanda, but if you can share with me your perspective on the judicial process. Is there any independence that characterizes it? What is the legal framework within which social protests are criminalized? And I think one of you spoke about 8 legal ways. I think I heard that. 8 legal ways to release political prisoners. 8 ways to release political prisoners. Did I get that right? Yes. So if you can speak to us about what those 8 ways are, because that will also help us maybe frame, well, first of all, that we would have to look into that, but then help us frame, some of our messaging to the Cuban state as we move forward. And then I think Fernanda asked it, but do these prison conditions under which political prisoners are being held, does it represent the state of prisons in Cuba generally? And then finally, in relation to the 10 precautionary measures and persons deprived of liberty, who would be what is the youngest age of some of persons criminalized because of the social protest? Thank you very much.
Well, to talk about prison conditions, there are 2 categories of prisons. One is for the closed regime, and it's a higher level of security. That is what are called prisiones, those prisons, and then there are the penitentiary establishments where the security conditions are minimal. They're called correctional centers. Most of the times, persons who are deprived of liberty in those cases are subject to forced labor. They're called semi-open because they don't have the same security, but they have the same conditions of lack of food, lack of medical care. That cuts across both regimes, even though the persons who are in the correctional penitentiary centers can get passes to exit for 3 or 4 days to go home and then come back. That's one of the main differences. The other one is a closed regime, and it has different areas. That is to say, it's graduated. There's a severe regime, a medium severe regime, and then there's a medium regime. And then those in medium are then transferred to the semi-open centers. There's also prison establishments for persons with HIV. One of the persons we've discussed is in one of those. That's the main difference. Now, the situation of food and medical care in the prisons is generalized. Now, in terms of the political prisoners, they are less fearful of denouncing the situations. For example, the law on criminal enforcement. Well, normally persons who are deprived of liberty don't have access to internet in the prisons, and so what they use their family members in order to make international denunciations. This means that there's also some pressure against the family members who denounce the situation of those deprived of liberty, who denounce it internationally, especially those who are being punished for political reasons. So there is pressure on the families because particularly if they denounce. In terms of judicial independence, I think there are some others here at the table who might want to answer the questions, but the courts in Cuba are not independent. So the judicial proceedings were all controlled by the Ministry of Interior. We were able to observe the judgments in the proceedings against those who were demonstrating on July 11th, and one common pattern that we saw in those judgments was the lack of clear evidence against the demonstrators. The evidence would situate the protesters at the protest, but there was no indication whatsoever that they had used violence, and all of them had a strong political charge. So there was similarity across the political arguments. For example, the judgments if there was a difference between Holguín, Havana, and Matanzas, or rather, they were all like copy and paste. And they were all accused of sedition. No distinction was drawn between protest and sedition, and like the Ministry of Interior, it's all under the control of the executive. Thank you. In response to the specific question on sexual violence or gender violence faced, for example, by the ladies in white, I'd like to highlight, as we've done before the Commission, that the ladies in white, in effect, suffer a differentiated risk on grounds of gender, and because they're human rights defenders, that puts them in a special situation of vulnerability, which is materialized in acts of violence of various sorts, for example, physical, verbal assaults on a repeated basis on Sundays when they try to march to mass or participate in mass. There's also psychological violence used against them when they are called before the authorities, and they also suffer because of their role of mothers. When Jacqueline Heredia was threatened that custody of her children would be removed as a way to pressure her because of her activism. So the gender violence finds different forms of expression, different nuances. We documented that from 2013 to 2022, there were 226 physical and gender-related violent acts against the ladies in white. And this figure should be even a bit more because we haven't put in the figures for 2023. And another question I want to refer to before I give the floor to my colleague is the question of family members. At Race and Equality, we have evidenced the direct impact on the family members. In the case of Yadiel Garcia, we had to extend the precautionary measure to his brother Almaguer because he was active in defending the rights of his brothers deprived of liberty. His case is quite particular because he suffers a retina problem that means his eyesight is worsening all the time. And what's happened is he has been denied access of the right to health. Because he's so visible in respect of his brother's situation, he's faced limitations in accessing this right. Yes, very briefly, with respect to the questions on medicine and how it is handled in prison, it is totally, very arbitrarily handled. We've been following up, and for those who have precaution measures, Ferreira Navarro, they're not allowed to have their medicines. This is very serious. For in the case of Felix Navarro, Felix has fainted several times in prison. He's 64 years old. He suffers from serious diabetes, and he's not allowed to have a glucometer. The glucometer is always in the hands of the authority, and it becomes a blackmail. They blackmail him as to whether they're going to do the blood sugar test. What's his response? Well, I don't want it. They're not going to blackmail me. And this places him in a totally vulnerable situation, similar to that of Jose Daniel Ferrer, who has been in solitary ever since he's been in prison. Marta described the aberrations that he's suffering from, and it's not known what medicines he's being given, when he gets the medicine. It's also the case of Javier Delgado Torna, who refuses to receive medicine because it becomes a form of blackmail. In his case, the medicine allows him to live. Javier, at this time, is constantly facing the danger of death in prison, and that is why your voices and your speaking out as Inter-American Commission is so important. Taking advantage of the fact that we still have a few minutes left, I want to refer to a family that also benefits from a precautionary measure. They're not in prison, but 3 of the members of the family were just accused. Well, a precautionary measure was imposed on them. This is the Miranda Leiva family that has a precautionary measure that goes back to November 2020. In this case, Mario Alberto Hernandez Leiva. In this case, the siblings, Fidel Manuel and 2 others, are facing charges for public disorder, once again, disobedience, and a precautionary measure has been imposed that is not recognized by them. The family's mobility is restricted to the province of Holguín, and they are considered victims of state terrorism and hate crimes. by the Cuban government. Another very sensitive case is that of Mario Alberto Hernandez Leyda, who is vice president of an organization for a new republic. Mario Alberto has been in prison for several months. He has been tortured. He has been subjected to outrageous treatment by the authorities of the prison. He's one of the more than 1,000 prisoners who are suffering such ill treatment on the island in this regard. I just want to refer finally to the recommendations that have been read and that you have echoed, oftentimes lamenting the absence of the Cuban state here and now. I must tell you, we don't expect anything from the Cuban state. We do expect something from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and that is why that recommendation is included, that you please raise your voice at the OAS, at the Permanent Council, that you go to the states who have the responsibility to defend the rights of all peoples to democracy, especially the Cuban people, who find themselves in such a precarious situation vis-a-vis the possibilities that we have of gaining access to mechanisms for defending our human rights. And so we ask you once again to implement this idea of going to the Permanent Council, to the member states of the OAS, and that they to hear the voices of civil society, the very precarious situation of the political prisoners.
I just want to wrap up. The difference between the treatment of political prisoners, because I believe this is a concern of the Commission with regard to the benefits of a precautionary measure of those who are prisoners. In most of the cases, we've made clear that before the precautionary measure, the situation is horrible, it's a repressive, and then after the precautionary measure is granted, it doesn't improve the situation. It doesn't benefit. It benefits the person, but the state doesn't do anything. There's a measure of satisfaction because there's no domestic remedies to resort to, and so at least they feel satisfaction about being granted like in the case of Feliz Navarro and other people who are being held in custody. There's no remedies. There are judicial remedies. There's no courts or no way to remedy the situation, but precautionary measures at least shed light on or bring into focus the fact that these people are deprived of liberty. So there's no change with regard to the responsibility of the state to protect human rights, but it's important that these measures on behalf of the victim, this recognition, this need, and this visibility, because they want this process to happen because of the visibility. Now, with regard to some of the questions that were posed, particularly the violence and harassment against family members, not only harassment against family members is habitual. It's horizontal, so to speak. It affects every member of the family. I don't know any family of a political party that doesn't express. It doesn't say that there's been absolute repression against them. And the examples of the 30-year-old Lady Catalina, the daughter of Mr. Perez, was brought together with her grandmother before state security. She's 3 years old, and when the grandmother told the officer that the little girl's only 3 years old, how can you summon her? If you don't, it'll be disobedience will be the crime. You'll be guilty of it. But the son of Marisol Caterina Costa Pena, who's 7 years old, was interrogated by the state security without the presence of her parents a few months ago. The parents were accused of other acts against the normal development of the child because of the activities of Human Rights Act advocacy, because the Cuban Family Code allows for reasons of thought and without any judicial final judgment to pull out, remove not only the custody of the child, but also parental rights over their children. Take away their children. The daughter of Lopez Valle, who was sentenced to several years for disrespect of authorities. Her daughter was Natalie Alvarez Lopez, was taken away, the custody was taken away from her mother for these reasons, because of her political thought for years, the bullying and the persecution that these children endure. But the teacher told her, if you had hair on your pubic hairs, then it would be different. So that's sexual harassment to bring this. The range of these abuses is incredible. And so this is common and habitual for all families of political prisoners, that denial of access to work and health and care and other things. Who doesn't suffer extreme repression? Those who submit, who keep silent and do what they're told. But those who have precautionary measures, whether they have a benefit or no benefit, what any political prisoner in Cuba means or involves greater containment of brutality, because if it was anonymous, it would be absolutely hideous. The precautionary measures at least eliminate do they eliminate certain degree of brutality? No. But if we didn't have the precautionary measures, the UN protection, if this visibility wasn't light shed on it, it would be exponential. The brutality would be exponential. And then you were asking about the legal process in Cuba. In Cuba is a monolithic state, as you know, and based on the Article 5, which has been in every constitution, in all legal definition of Cuba. Article 5 of the Constitution says that the higher force of the state is the Communist Party, and everything swirls around that pyramid. The Communist Party decides everything. And if we start, as we've started in a lot of studies and analysis of how that power emanates, we can see that absolutely everything, the judiciary, resources, every public servant is dependent on decisions of the Communist Party, which is very linked to another monolith, which is of the repression, which is the counterintelligence apparatus. And the Ministry of Interior is another monolith. So no judges or attorneys or prosecutors or any remedies or anything that you would think would provide an opportunity in Cuba to do anything on the legal front works when you confront the states, or the state interprets that you're confronting the state. There's no mechanism in place to provide legal protection within Cuba to any victim who suffers repression at the hands of the state. Nothing. Even a minimum, whether you attempt, you only attempt for one reason, because we catch officials in their contradictions in the system. Also, if we try to exercise these rights, these functions, use these functions, if it weren't monolithic, it would work, but we put it in, we expose the system. There's no judge, nobody with any remedies, any judgment, and a person with Yudro Baban, he was supposed to be released, and the state security kept him in prison, even though the judge wasn't appealable. He was supposed to be released. There's no way. They do what they want. In Cuba, there's a illegal judiciary that's contingent upon the decisions of the Communist Party under the Constitution, and then the will of the political police. Even so, we must underscore, however, that the family members have vowed mostly to use domestic remedies. That's important for international institutions, because this questions asked them in the UN system, for example, and in the regional system as well. We were saying that there were no less than 8 ways to be able to be released, right? Not only released in every case, but to get out of jail, early release from custody, that is. We're talking about a system that is conditioned by the will of the Communist Party, remember. But also when we talk about different interlocutors, governments, institutions, they were told that the regime has brought this into the legal arena. Well, if they do so, there's instruments not to provide reparation for the damage, as we were, but to achieve for these people at least be with their family. What we're aiming for, and what we're pointing out there, the 8 ways, legal ways that contemplate from pardon, in amnesty, and then the Black Spring prisoners used one of these, conditional release, special release, and alternate measures of incarceration, measures to incarceration. And the Supreme Court has mentioned in a judgment, and it's hashed out the proceeding to be able to analyze from an expert's, psychological expert's point of view, the convict situation. And the Supreme Court has actually said if this procedure is not actually respected, that case can be dismissed. But a lot of political prisoners, this proceeding was not respected for them. So the instruction of the Supreme Court, which was a recent Supreme Court judgment, but it's not an international, it's an international standard of due process to evaluate convictions of defendants. We're providing all this documentation so that you can look at it calmly and analyze it. Thank you. So I would like to speak a bit about what happens with the family members of the political prisoners in Cuba and everyone who finds to bring about a free Cuba. And I particularly, I want to talk about my own experience with my family, with my brothers, my siblings, and my parents. I'm giving you this. It's quite depressing and sad for me. I stopped seeing when I was 4 years old, I stopped seeing my father when he was wrongly jailed. I was 4 years old, and my brother was 3 months old. And from that point on, for us, it was hell. That's what began there. We were repudiated and bullied at school. I was beaten as a minor. When I would go to the marches of the Damas de Blanco, I saw when my father was taken into jail and my mother when they were beaten. I was in the presence of a lot of acts of repudiation. I was the target of all these things that the dictatorship does to psychologically and physically break down all of us, the children, the mothers, all people in Cuba are the victims of this. They continue, I know. It's not only my case. There's many families in Cuba who want to free Cuba. Their children undergo the same thing. They suffer the same because this really is so harmful to all of us, the children. And even outside of Cuba, and continue to suffer the effects of the dictatorship. For 5 years, I've been here in this country, and I'm unable to go back to my country. I'm not allowed to see my father. I'm not able to see my 6-year-old daughter. For 5 years, I haven't seen her, and all of this because of my father was simply an opposition member. He wanted a free Cuba, and I support him from here, and I will continue to support my father so that Cuba is free, becomes free.
Very much, Representative of Civil Society. I think we are at the end. Yes, I think. Yes, we are at the end of this session to review the status of the precautionary measures, and we've gone a little bit outside of that, but I think all of it has been highly relevant. We really take note of your recommendations. I think there were maybe 8 or 9 And we would like to ask you to send in those recommendations to us so that we actually have a record of that. But a number of the recommendations to me seem really within the competence and the obligation of the Commission. The public pronouncements calling on the release of political prisoners, the improvement of prison conditions, follow-up resolutions, including, of course, information in Chapter 4B, emphasizing the deterioration of persons who are beneficiaries of precautionary measures, the adoption of best practice. So I think and the holding of a special session, I think I also heard that. And I also really heard the impassioned call for the Commission to use its space, its location within the inter-American system and within the inter-American human rights system to call attention to the violations of human rights and the breakdown of what essentially is rule of law and democracy in that country. I want to say we would welcome all of the information that you have in written form, and that can be sent by the usual mechanisms. We will have a debriefing amongst the commissioners, where we will speak to some of your speak to the recommendations that you have made, and also think through how we can implement and execute some of them, if not all of them. So with that, I think, Fernanda, do you have any final words? I want to thank you for, coming with us, spending this time with us. It's very difficult what you do, because you're living through the consequences, some of you directly and also through the experiences of your family members and your friends and the people who care about the people of Cuba in Cuba. Thank you very much for your testimony and for your advice to the Commission. And with that, Commissioner Mantilla and Fernanda, it's my obligation now to bring this hearing to a close. And thank you very much once again. And I'm going to hit this bell. Good afternoon, everyone. I open hearing number 13 of the 188th regular session of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And this hearing is entitled, Protection of the Human Rights of Trans Children and Adolescents in Brazil, which was requested by the NGO Mina Crianca Trans. I hope I have the pronunciation right. My name is Roberta Clark, and I am the second vice chair of the Commission, and I'm also the rapporteur for the rights of LGBTI persons. I'm accompanied by Commissioner Mantia, who's a rapporteur for Brazil, but also the rapporteur for the rights of women. We will be joined, I hope, by the Deputy Executive Secretary, Maria Claudia Peludo, as well as the rapporteur for economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights, Mr. Javier Palomo. So I want to begin with the greetings to the state representatives and to civil society and to Jan Yarab, who is a regional representative of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I believe he's online. Can someone confirm that for me, George? Is the High Commissioner online? Yes. Okay, great. High Commissioner he's the representative of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights for South America, and he is online. The purpose of this hearing is to receive information on the right to comprehensive protection of trans children and adolescents in Brazil, as well as on progress and challenges on this issue with the involvement of human rights defenders, family members, trans children and adolescents, guaranteeing their right to be heard. Now, here is how we're going to organize our time. We have an hour and a half, I think, until 5:30. So civil society, you start with 20 minutes of presentation. The state will respond with 20 minutes or whatever presentation they wish to make, another 20 minutes. The United Nations expert online will have 7 minutes to participate. And then the Commission, we have 20 minutes within which to ask questions for clarification or to share some of our perspectives on the issues raised. We go back to civil society for another 10 minutes of comments, equivalent time for the state, 10 minutes, and then we close the session. So with that, civil society representatives, you have the floor.
Buenas tardes, Presidenta.
Good afternoon, Madam President. Good afternoon to the members of the Human Rights Commission. Special greetings to Commissioner Yulisa, who it's nice to see you again. Also, the rapporteur for economic, social, and cultural and environmental rights, Javier Palomo, and also the Assistant Secretary and the representatives of the Brazilian state. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to begin with a short 1-minute video, and I'm going to ask that it be shown now.
Segundo e não menos importante, as crianças trans, elas existem e as
trans children do exist, and they and their families are have to be respected. I am speaking. We can hear somebody saying in the audience that trans children do not exist. Trans children do not exist. Trans children do not exist.
Well, that is a session of the Brazilian Congress with representatives elected by society, and this was on last September 5th. One more thing, Madam President, as a matter of security, we do have an 8-year-old girl here. So I ask that the cameras not capture her face, please. I'm now going to give the floor to the president of the NGO Minha Criança Trans.
Good afternoon, one and all. I'm very happy to be here. Tamires Nunes is my name. I'm founder of the only organization that fights for trans children and adolescents in Brazil. We understand as children, every person up to 18 years old, these people are violated and they have to be protected as children. We came up with this organization because of the violence against this population, and for 14 consecutive years that this group has been violated and has been suffering violence. And I ask that these trans children and adolescents need to be alive in order to have a future. We acknowledge their rights in the UN Commission and in other organizations. They are vulnerable, and our trans children and adolescents have been more and more vulnerable, exposed to violations of their rights. They need specific protection so that they can develop. We're very concerned because we live in a country with a new configuration of Congress and other political organizations who know about the lack of legislation to protect these children. Besides that, there are not enough data about the population, which leads to hate speech and violence against these children and their families. They insist on saying that trans children and adolescents do not exist. This is a result of their families and the fact that they don't believe in God. There are over 22 bills in states and in the federal government that want to take a step back in terms of what was already done on behalf of these children and adolescents. These people exist. We are not going to give up on our children, and the Brazilian state needs to acknowledge them and protect them.
Agatha Maria.
Now invite the child Agatha Maria, 8 years old. She is a trans child.
My name is Agatha Maria. I am a trans child. I am much loved by friends and family members. I exist as a trans child, and I am very happy. I would like my mom to be only mine, but she needs to fight for my rights and those of all trans children. And this is not good. Okay, a kiss to everyone.
I now invite the adolescent Celeste Ambrusti.
My name is Celeste Ambrucio. I'm 18 years old. During my last high school year, I came out of the closet, so to speak, at 14. And I am sure that nobody will be able to silence us. All of you who have children who are here and who are here virtually, imagine that your child only has 34 hours left to live. This is how parents of trans children feel, because in Brazil, a country that for 14 consecutive years was the country that killed the most trans children, on average of one death every 34 hours. I was able to survive, and to study as a normal person. But I know that this is not the standard, because most of these children are thrown out of their houses. They end up becoming prostitutes in order to survive. I hope that our existence here can be acknowledged. This is what I had to say.
Ahora invito al adolescente Apollo Camini, un adolescente trans.
Online, sinto-me honrado em participar desta audiência, contribuindo para a garantia dos direitos de crianças e adolescentes trans. Hoje estou aqui para fazer um breve relato da minha história. Meu nome é Apollo, um menino trans de 16 anos, sou afrodescendente e descendente de asiáticos, fascinado pelo espaço e pela astronomia. Todos os dias acordo e reflito como posso fazer para aumentar a minha expectativa de vida, desenvolvendo assim a ansiedade devido à incerteza do meu futuro. Desde a minha infância, eu sofro preconceito, chegando até sofrer agressões físicas e verbais, devido ao meu jeito natural de ser, pelas minhas vestimentas, pelos meus gostos e preferências mais radicais, não que sejam considerados do gênero masculinos, mas ainda são questões que precisam ser desconstruídas no Brasil. Diante das dificuldades, comecei a procurar por procedimentos para minimizar a opressão, sendo um deles o uso do binder, uma faixa compressora utilizada para esconder o volume dos seios e que, se usada por muito tempo, pode deformar o desenvolvimento da caixa torácica. Outro procedimento que tive o privilégio de fazer foi a mudança do meu nome nos documentos, algo que torna a minha vida menos constrangedora, podendo ser quem eu realmente sou, além de iniciar a harmonização para diminuir os preconceitos e adequar o meu corpo aos olhares da sociedade. E a partir dessas opressões, percebi que precisaria me dedicar 2, 3 vezes mais para poder ter talvez a chance de ocupar cargos ou conquistar algo, seja no âmbito acadêmico ou profissional, além dos desafios existentes nos relacionamentos pessoais. Gostaria de agradecer a todas as mulheres trans e homens trans que já lutaram.
In terms of my personal relationships, I would like to thank all of those who were nice to us and accepted us. I hope that one day we will live in a better world that will take us in and accept us. Luis Guilherme, a trans adolescent. Good afternoon to all. My name is Luis Guilherme. I'm 15 years old. I follow the Umbanda religion. I'm here with the group of Minha Criança Trans. During my childhood and adolescence, I was always very free to express myself. I got closer and closer to my feminine side when I became an adolescent. In 2021, I was sure that I was a boy. I told my mom about this, and she had a very good reaction, as I expected. Gynecologist was very transphobic for me, and as we talked about alternatives to cut short my menstruation. And the doctor asked me, why don't you accept yourself? Why don't you accept who you are? And I answered, doctor, you identify as a man, right? How about if you were called by a feminine noun, you had your menses, and would you be happy? The questioning by the doctor made me very uncomfortable and reprimanded me. He demonstrated a lack of sensitivity to deal with a trans patient. In school, transition was also difficult. In 2022, a professor had access to my previous name. This professor called me by my previous name, and in another class he said that being trans is wrong. This does not exist. It's a social convention because what is important is biological sex. This professor ruined my life, made me more anxious, and I was isolated in school. till when myself and other adolescents and children who are trans would have to face this kind of situation and be rare exceptions? Until when will I have to cry every night? Not because I don't accept myself, but because I know that if I were cisgender, my life would be much easier. Today, I come to the OAS as on behalf of the Guilherme of the past, because why should Guilherme of today want simply to live his life? And sometimes this is not allowed. But this Guilherme will continue to fight for all the Guilhermes of tomorrow so that they be protected and supported by the state until a day when everybody will understand that we do exist and we are here. Thank you very much.
I now ask a trans woman who is an activist. This is Rafael Ueste.
Can you hear me? Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. I'm very happy to be here. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there in person, but good afternoon. I greet the commissioners of the IAHCR, of the OAS. I'm Rafael Vicious from the south of the country of Brazil. I'm 40 years and I supervise social projects, and I work on behalf of LGBT since very young. I wasn't born at 18. At 14 years old, I noticed that I was a trans person, but this was in the 90s when homosexuality was considered a disease. You can imagine trans people. In the beginning, I perceived that it was very difficult to continue. At the time, there was no policy, health, education, human rights, and respect in general for this group didn't exist. I was an example of how from my suffering I started my trajectory as a volunteer, coordinator, and then director of NGOs on behalf of LGBTI, both in my state and then in the country. In 2004, there was a campaign tied to HIV/AIDS. Then there was some evolution that contemplated only trans women. In 2013, I participated in the making up of this document, and then trans people in general were visualized, but these documents did not deal with children and adolescents. This movement has been evolving in terms of public policies and rights in Brazil, especially through the Supreme Court. But in spite of the efforts of all the movements, these do not benefit trans children and adolescents. They have to be followed by 5 stations, health stations that are specialized, and they have to wait up to 2 years. And we have the challenge of the Brazilian territory, which is gigantic. In the north and northeast, there are no such health stations. We are trying to revise the broadening of the documents of the unified health system, but we're very far from taking care of people, of trans people, since day one when they realize that they are trans. And although we cannot guarantee that, we cannot establish care for trans children and adolescents, not for the lack of scientific data, but what cannot be admitted is that is the culture of total invisibility on the part of the state. The state only considers these people from 18 years old on. Everything else is a conquest of social movements through a special decree of the presidential decree from 2016. In Rio de Janeiro, only older than 12 years old are taken into account. In another state, my state, from 16 on. We cannot be forgotten by the state, although we have the possibility and the right to health, safety, and education. I was a child which was forgotten by the Brazilian state, and I asked for your help in terms of not forgetting these children. Thank you very much.
Ahora, Maria Fernanda Fernandes, especialista en derechos.
Excelentíssimas comissionadas da Comissão
Interamericana. I greet all here present, the commissioners, the rapporteurs, and all here present. The Brazilian Constitution, the Child and Adolescent Institute, among other documents, establish a norm to full protection of children and adolescents. However, in Brazil, such integral protection does not cover children and adolescents. The public ministry has started verifying the absence of public policies in this case. Several representatives of organizations have verified the inefficiency of the present system to protect the rights of trans children and adolescents in Brazil. The permanent omission is a fact. Now there are at least 20 bills that are trying to take a step back in terms of such rights and dignity. Some of these projects include criminalization of the gender transition in youth and childhood. There are also attacks in social media that disseminate hate speech, which negates the existence of such children and adolescents. Therefore, the situation of this population in Brazil was altered from only omission to active members of the public power in terms of their negation of or denial of their existence, and trying to translating this into legislation to restrict the dignity of such groups. Therefore, the protection of the rights of trans children and adolescents is going through a very alarming and serious state, taking away their human dignity. Thank you very much.
Yo pregunto si es posible una.
Yo pregunto si puede haber una intervención adicional. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
Further on in the program, and you can continue there. But we will pass on to the state. I think it's now 22 minutes?
2 minutes.
2 extra minutes, because we have to do the
Okay.
same on both sides. So you do have 22 minutes, and you will get another chance to speak
In the second part.
in the second part.
Ok.
Obrigado, senhora presidenta. Roberta Clara.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Javier Palomo, representative of the Executive Secretariats, Maria Pulido, ladies and gentlemen from civil society, I'd like to introduce myself. I am the permanent representative of Brazil at the OAS. I'm here with my colleagues, Igor, Ellen, and Felipe, representing the Brazilian state and the federal government, which is able to speak on behalf of the state. I thank on behalf of the Brazilian state the invitation to speak here and reaffirm the Brazilian commitment with the international human rights system. I would like to mention some advancements in this area. We are convinced that we need to intensify the importance of the elimination of any discrimination, direct or indirect, against the groups that are object of this hearing. According to Article 227 of the Brazilian Constitution, the state has to guarantee children and adolescents the free exercise of their rights. This should protect them from negligent discrimination, exploitation, violence, cruelty, and oppression. Since the child and adolescent statute was passed, we have seen a change in paradigm. Since then, we have a new perception of their special condition in our juridical environment. Besides, considering the characteristics inherent to these groups, we have to give special attention to them. There were decisions by the Brazilian Federal Medicine Council. According to some of their documents, transsexuality was first understood as a disturbance of the identity of gender and then gender incongruous. Only in 2002, due to demands of the justice system of the civil society, this position was revised and it was incorporated in the unified health system. In the federal administration, a secretariat for the strategic administration at the federal level was created. Since the actions of this secretariat and its working group, the Ministry of Health has included such surgeries in the SUS, and it included it in the specialized attention to health. A new change occurred in 2010 when the Federal Medicine Council came up with a new resolution taking away the experimental surgeries in transsexual men. In 2011, the Ministry of Health instituted the National Policy of Integral Health of Lesbian, Gays, Bisexuals, Transvestite, and Transsexuals in the unified system. Among other things, it included guarantee to access to the process of transsexualizing, attention to problems due to prolonged use of hormones, definition of strategies to reduce morbidity and mortality of this group, guaranteeing the use of social name, among others. In 2013, the Ministry of Health redefined and broadened the process of transsexualization in the unified system. In a resolution of 2018, the Federal Psychology Council open up ways to deal with means that consider the pathology, everything related to the issue, and eliminated the anti-natural concept. In 2019, the Federal Council of Medicine published Resolution 2265, which still works. The document authorized the hormonal blockage in adolescents, among other procedures, acknowledging the theoretical accumulation with the publication of international line of cares, among others. Therefore, the Ministry of Health decided to revise the document that oriented this process.
Fundamentando suas decisões nas melhores práticas e evidências científicas. Por meio da portaria do Ministério da Saúde 841, de outubro de 2023, foi instituído o Grupo de Trabalho para a Revisão do Processo Transsexualizador no SUS.
We had a technical problem with one of the consuls. We'll try to follow the ambassador. And the improvement of the decision process based on several experiences in the Brazilian state. We take into account the International Society of Endocrinology, among others, in terms of the Special Secretariat within the Ministry of Health to take care of this, researchers and 4 councils. In 120 days since its creation, the working group needs to propose guidelines for specialized people in the trans population. In 2008, when the transsexualizer, so to speak, process was established in the southern part of the country. Now we have 22 specialized services. 9 include hospital stay and others in and out services. 11 of those services have been updated.
In addition to these services, the Secretary of Health works in municipalities so as to get closer. And in addition to knowing the reality of these, the Secretary of Attention Specialists for Health is also doing some technical visits. We've also decided to approach and look at some of the more recent networking for LGBTQI and others. With Human Rights for Citizenship, in 2023, the National Secretariat for Promotion and Defense of People, LGBTQI, was headed up by a trans woman. And I should also like to point out the setting up of a National Council for Rights of Lesbians, Gays, Bisexual, Transsexual, Queers, Intersex, and others. Also, there is a program for protecting children, for children and adolescents who are victims of transphobic violence. Through Resolution 233 of the National Council for Rights of Children and Adolescents, more specifically in Article 55, we promoted having rights for units and social educational assistance. We have to also look at 10 commitments for protection of rights for LGBTQI people. This document aims to guarantee safety in the digital arena and having awareness-raising programs. In the Human Rights Council of the United States in Brazil, became part of a group of friends of independent specialists for the protection of against violence, discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender. And we also were for a coalition of equal rights. We had an intergovernmental alliance of 43 states that were committed to ending violence, discrimination against gays, lesbians, bisexual, transgender, intersexual, and others. To these efforts, we have a lot of different campaigns, posters, and other cultural projects so that we can raise the awareness about people who are LGBTQ&I. In addition to these politics, I should also like to say that these measures for raising awareness, prevention, and fighting against all kinds of violence, especially systematic intimidation or bullying, are developed within the framework of schools, as well as the promotion of a safe environment, peace, and respect for human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, according to Article 12 of the Law of Guidelines for National Education, 1966, it's up to the Union to coordinate these different educational policies and to exercise them in the educational arenas. In addition to the constitutional imperatives and legal frameworks, the National System for Education, we need to have an improvement in education so that public policy can ensure rights and equity. The standards that we have were in 3 basic documents: the National Program for Human Rights 3, the Orienting Guideline for Education, Culture, and Human Rights, National Plan for Education and Human Rights, and National Guidelines for Education and Human Rights. Now, human rights is one of the main pillars for education. We also say that this is based on human dignity, equality of rights, recognition and valuing differences and diversity. The lay aspect of the state democracy and education, cross-cutting nature, global and other experiences, and it also aims to having training for life and living together. This has to do with the literacy improvements for young people, diversity and inclusion, which was set up in 2023 with the Ministry of Education. Here we have to have planning, orientation, coordination, implementation of policies for education on human rights in Brazil. The activities of the Secretariat, especially the coordination for educational policies for human rights, aim to have these guiding instruments in public policy and that they are carried out by the federal agencies. The main objective, which is to reach and have all kinds of awareness-raising campaigns, especially against bullying, and to have this in schools, and to have safe schools. Ladies and gentlemen, the commissioners, civil society, the Brazilian state tries to internally mature a discussion on the topic we're looking at today. As far as concerns the specific aspect here, it is relevant and it's present. So in this regard, we have to implement a host of different public policies which are geared toward human rights of children and adolescents, as well as the LGBTQIA+. In 2 lines. First, this is anchored in principles of absolute and universality of state attention as to the rights of children and adolescents. These principles are enshrined in the Statute of Children and Adolescents. And then secondly, there is the need to have specific attention so that the universality that the national policy wants is not used to keep inequalities up and running. The approach built by the Brazilian state aims to have children and adolescents who can have their rights free to express themselves in their diversity and their gender without their being hurt or thrown into clinical taxonomies. We work to have free diversity without the need to have any all-encompassing diagnostic. We just want to have children and adolescents enjoying their human rights in the Institute of the Children's Organization of the Constitution. We also want to respect their development according to the full-fledged or comprehensive protection doctrine. So we wanted to say these things to the Commission. We can have other explanations in writing, as well as give you information on public policies that we have in force. We would need more time to do this here in this, but we do understand the importance and the progress that has been made by the Brazilian state, and we truly appreciate and will take due note of all the points raised in this hearing. Thank you very much. We'll send them off to the public administration authorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive report. And now I turn to the Commission for responses and questions, and I start with Commissioner Mantia.
Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Firstly, thank you to civil society for your presence here and also for the daily struggle you engage in, your efforts every day. And we understand that they're present right now, that you're representing a whole community. And we are grateful to the state of Brazil for its presence and for its presentation. this.
The second mistake I've made, because there is the representative of the High Commission for Human Rights online. I do apologize, sir. Do you wish to make a presentation now, and we can come back to Commissioner Mantia?
Yeah, sure.
Yes. And you have 7 minutes.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, and apologies once again.
No. Buenas tardes, voy a hablar en español. Saludo a...
I speak in Spanish, and I welcome those who are present, who have joined us.
En mi capacidad como...
And so, those who are I represent I'm the representative for South America and South America. And I thank you for providing information orally here, and I'm honored. In the world, in the Americas, I got it. In Americas, since 2013, we lead the Free and Equal campaign for equality, LGBTI+, and we have been disseminating information and raising awareness to mobilize and defend human rights of LGBTI+ persons in collaboration with different UN agencies like UN AIDS, UN Women. In Brazil, we are quite concerned because of the pervasive and multiple violations of human rights against the trans and transvestite population. As was mentioned, there have been murders of trans persons and hate crimes, and then there's been efforts in the legislatures as well, even against children. In this context, it's important to speak of the importance of it's important to speak of the implement of laws and provisions that ban discrimination against trans people, children, and even young people and in adult age. Consequently, as a consequence of the discrimination and stereotypes of trans people, frequently they are not guaranteed full right to education, health, self-determination, equality, and personal security. The respect for the identity of gender identity, support, multidisciplinary and family support are fundamental for these children and young people to build their lives with all the guarantees of well-being, protections of their well-being, and to contribute to the development of societies and the Brazilian state. Children and adolescents have the right to live in a safe and welcoming family setting and to social participation, and to be considered in the center of processes that have to do with their life, including decisions that they would like to be in which they like to be called to take part. To prevent violations against these trans children and young people, we underscore how central it must be to recognize their gender identification, and the importance of ensuring in schools and inclusive education settings and safe ones free of bullying, etc. And because children, they have the right to exercise freely their right to different genders than what they were assigned at birth, and they're guaranteed the right to participate in decisions that affect their lives. And recognition of their condition as subjects of law entitled to this is a central aspect to their dignity. Also, it's essential that families and communities have the best information possible to provide support to these young trans children and adolescents, guaranteeing that they live without harassment or violence or bullying, and also the authorities themselves need to gather reliable, accurate, broken down, disaggregated data about the situation of trans youth. It's an urgent need to obtain results and adopt measures, effective measures directed at the major challenge of this population. Also, I have a few words about the health care. Children and trans children and adolescents often face obstacles to access to health care because of several different factors, such as the lack of adequate professional training geared towards comprehensive health care specifically for trans health, and health directives geared towards a pathologizing perspective is what they face. In June 2023, the National Association of Transsexuals, ANTRA, traditional ally in Brazil of the UN Human Rights, published a technical note about access specifically to trans people. And we believe that this note is an important tool to confront the narratives that seek through scientific denial and moral panic to ban access that's guaranteed for specific care for trans children and criminalize professionals and families and caretakers. With relation to the 17th National Health Conference, we hail the approval of 19 proposals that deal with trans children. This shows the willingness of the state of Brazil to change and improve how this group is welcomed and cared for in the health system and social assistance, expanding attention and providing opportunities for debate about effective social policies. We salute these initiatives. We also underscore that it's essential that practices for access to health and education and other rights are formulated from a human rights perspective and also go hand in hand with actions that recognize the existence and the citizenship of trans children and adolescents. This effort must be made between the state, civil society, and regional and international organizations to guarantee that the legal framework and public policy framework fulfill the most demanding requirements in the area of human rights. And I have some if you give me a few seconds to just say that the United Nations is committed significantly to each and every one of these young people today and in the future, guaranteeing non-discrimination of teenagers and all these children and to their gender identity as part of our mission with relation to the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I now turn properly back to Commissioner Mantilla.
Okay.
Sorry for interrupting you.
Don't worry about it. Bueno, como decía, reitero el saludo.
As I was saying, greetings to civil society and to the state as well, and cordial greetings to John Jaraf, our colleague at the UN, who's always takes part at these hearings. He's a regular. I also appreciate the response of the Brazilian state beyond the complex situation that we're facing right now. I had a few specific questions, first to the state. Today, we've been told, and it's quite documented, as the representative had said, the bullying, the assaults, aggression, and discrimination of the trans population, particularly children and teenagers. We're all in agreement that trans children exist. That's our point of departure here. And secondly, we have to look at this approach with an intersectional perspective, the principle of non-discrimination and equality. We have some trans who can be Afro descendants indigenous, they could have disabilities. So it's a significant challenge to the state, this intersectionality. When I'm talking about care, we have public policy with regard to health care, but also we have research, or that is investigation into acts of violence. I want to know if the state can tell us, how have you incorporated a specific approach for investigating and prosecuting and punishing cases of aggression against the trans population, particularly children, trans children. And these assaults, these acts of aggression can be directly, or there could be denial of care, specific care, and at school as well. And this type of situation I'd like to know about, state. And furthermore, I would like to know from the state and contribute based on the standards issued set by the Inter-American Court with the notion for the civil society should review this as well as the state. The Inter-American Court in Azul Rojas v. Peru, Azul Rojas Marin, it's a person who at that time was a gay person, now it's a trans person. The court viewed this violence that beyond being a hate crime, it's a prejudice-based violence based on prejudice against a person. This was a trans person, and that's what it was about. This concept also was hashed out in Vicky Hernandez versus Honduras, and it would be important as well to take a look at this. I know that these are children, but this should be reviewed because this notion, I believe, is very important to see this type of violence, which is of prejudice-based. I have a prejudice about what you look like, and I have a prejudice about what you wear, how you speak. And so it's important for trans children to be familiar with these tools, and also the state to incorporate it in these public policies. And additionally, I was saying, we recognize, because it cannot be denied, that there are trans children. How does the state recognize this inclusion? I can recognize that they exist, that they're there, but how do you include them in health care and work, the labor market, and education, etc.? Taking advantage of the presence of John Tarab. You know, Commissioner Clark is the rapporteur of the Inter-American System with regard to LGBTI affairs. And also there's a rapporteur in the UN system on this subject matter. So I wanted to link this to trans children issue. I want this to be reviewed, both what the Inter-American system as well as the UN system has done, where the rapporteur himself says that these conversion therapies constitute torture and cruel treatment, and cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment. So once again, I appreciate the presence of the state. Once again, I want to say, I know you're not going to be able to provide a response, but I want you to take on this challenge, live up to the challenge, because trans children exist. How to respond? It's a challenge, but I think the first thing is you have to do is recognize that they exist. And secondly, to decide or look at how there can be direct participation of trans children in all of this. Why am I saying this? Because we can have a desktop public policy can be created, but nobody better than trans children to say what they're feeling, what's going on the ground. I wanted to remind you with regard to the Inter-American Commission, we held a hearing that was made up of mostly by children, Ecuadorian children. It had to do with prevention of sexual violence at school. So the children took part directly. This is a more mixed hearing. This is because we have colleagues, we have Fernand, and recently we were before the court. We were down at the court. It was a co-ed hearing. You're taking part directly. The 8-year-old child's here. And I think that's of the utmost importance, because there's the agency here. You representative of other children who are in the same situation. So I wanted to ask you a question. I wanted to ask you directly a question to these children. How do you feel that this participation should be? What do you feel? What are you expecting? What are you hoping beyond recognition of your existence? How do you feel you can be included? And what are you expecting of the Inter-American Commission? We'd also be very interested in knowing, what do you expect of us? What do you hope from us? And reiterate I want to reiterate, we'll always be with you. We're there for you as always. Thank you.
Commissioner Mantia. I would like to turn over to our Special Rapporteur, Javier Polo.
It appears his microphone isn't working. Somebody has to give him a microphone. I can't. Yep, you can see the red light. It's not on.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for the technical support, getting us sound. Now we sorted this problem out of the sound. So, I want to thank the organizations and the individuals who have brought about this hearing, or to bring about and to raise the profile and shed light and bring into focus this issue. It's of the utmost importance, particularly because of the absence of a view that includes the obligations that belong to the state to ensure the rights of this specific population or segment of the population. I also want to express my gratitude to the state's representative, Brazil's representatives, and the report that you have presented to the Commission at this thematic hearing. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to witness, to be here and interact, engage in the framework of this dialogue about such a relevant topic. Basically, what I want to, I also first want to thank Jean Girard, the representative in South America of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. I want to take advantage of this opportunity to ask 3 questions, essentially. The first question, after hearing the state's report delivered, I felt at one point that there was a certain degree of a sort of siloed approach, compartmentalized approach, after perhaps it was because you were unable to really delve deep into explaining it. That may be why I got the impression. However, how to ensure a comprehensive perspective in protecting the rights of this specific group and avoid compartmentalization of the sectoral responses. And I'm interested in it from several different perspectives. First of all, to how to make sure that there's a perspective that from birth or young children in public policies geared to protecting, ensure the rights of LGBTI plus persons, and how to achieve this sort of positive contamination for us. There should pervade this. Positiveness should pervade the whole thing. And it should be considered in this equation of public policies, that is, the rights of this specific segment of the population, and also how to ensure that the diversity perspective is present in policies regarding young children, is present in the care and protection institutions of children, and present in the education system in schools, and that is present as well in healthcare institutions as well. So it's both things, the perspective of diversity and public policies traditionally geared towards the minor population under 18 years of age. And somehow this perspective of the best interests of the child also be present has to in public policies geared towards protecting, ensuring the rights of the LGBTI plus population. Because in this response to the of the status where reality can be transformed, and that's where we can see this actually happen as a result of this hearing.
The third and final aspect that I found so interesting I'd like to request more information about it is related to how, beyond the programmatic and normative aspects, in the case of Brazil, Brazil is moving forward in transforming institutional practices where they are committed, or what is involved are values, aspects having to do with different visions of morality, which in some cases are worked into the statute of institutions, such as religious institutions that carry out activities to protect the rights of children and adolescents. So those are basically the three issues. These questions are primarily for Brazil, but I'd also ask civil society to also consider making remarks that would shed light on the matter for the Commission and the Rapporteur on Economic, Social, Culture, and Environmental Rights, how this supporting the rights of children from a standpoint of diversity is being incorporated into public policy and being able to, so as to be able to bring about institutional changes that go beyond the normative aspects. Thank you very much.
I turn to our Deputy Executive Secretary for her comments, questions.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. Primero que todo, yo...
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I want to give special greetings to Tata, Celeste, Apollo, and Luis Guillerme. Thank you very much for participating and for being here. We heard your message. I exist, I'm right here. And we recognize you. I also would like to express gratitude for all the very detailed information that the state has provided us today, because right now we are working at the request of the Commission on two reports that are most relevant. One has to do with human rights, culture, and education, like strategies for public policy in the region. And you made a reference in your overview of the different public policies over, say, a 20-year period. You made reference to very important elements, and it would be very interesting if you could delve a little bit further into the last one, which has to do with education and geared to LGBTI persons. Madam President, I'd also like to briefly indicate that the Commission has made very specific recommendations to the states in its report on recognition of the rights of LGBTI persons. And I wanted to mention this to you so that you can help disseminate it. One of the elements it puts forward is that guaranteeing the construction of adequate medical protocols for comprehensive care for LGBTI persons, respecting their sexual orientation and gender identity and bodily diversity. And particularly, its recommendation 18, laws on gender identity that should guarantee the rights of girls, boys, children, and adolescents to the affirmation of their gender identity based on the free, prior, and informed consent. We believe that that's an essential element, that is to say, participation. And just to conclude, I would note that we're working on a protocol on the participation of other children and adolescents in the various mechanisms of the Commission. The Commission wants to hear you. We want you to be part of the Commission's activities as Inter-American Human Rights System. Thank you so much, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Maria Claudia. I just have maybe like 2 or 3 questions, and I want to start off like my colleagues, thanking the civil society organizations and especially to the young people who have come here today to share your evolving stories and to insist on your right to be free to be, as we all need that right to be who we are. And I really want to also thank the state for your report on the progress that you're making to eradicate discrimination and to guarantee equality and free diversity. I like the language of free diversity. I like that characterization. And you speak about respecting children's developments with a comprehensive protection doctrine. And you outlined quite a lot of progress that has been made at the level of the state and at the level of public policies, whether it's in the health sector, in the education sector, the bit of social protection. There's quite a lot of policy development, the right to gender identity, and so on. Notwithstanding all of that progress, and that progress is at the level of law, so I suppose it's normative progress, and that's really important because without the normative, you can't make change. But my question is similar to Maria Claudia's question, which is what efforts or what strategies has the Brazilian state have you employed to change the culture? So there is what they call the high politics of policy, but then there's the deep politics of culture. What happens at the level of communities? What happens in the streets? What happens in the schools? What happens institutionally? So you can have a very strong policy on the right to non-discrimination and access to health care, but you have institutional discrimination because the teams of state actors who are populating the schools and the health institutions and the police, for example, justice sector, may also continue to have conscious and unconscious bias. So my question for the state is, what actions are you taking to socialize these changing norms, this progress in policy, so that you can ensure institutional accountability for implementing laws and policies, and that you can also root the culture of non-discrimination in popular culture. So that's really my broad question for the state. And in relation to civil society organizations, you did speak about there's a tension because there's some progress, but there's regression, or there are attempts at regression. It's perhaps what I understood. Mm-hmm. And you spoke about 20 bills or 22 bills seeking to take back rights, and in specific, the criminalization of gender transitions in youth and children and childhood. And I wanted to understand a little bit more about that. Is that a bill at the federal level? The 20 bills, are they at federal level or at state level? And what is this bill of criminalization? What is it really? What's the content of it? And where is it in the scheme of legislative developments? Thank you very much. So I think that's it for us as the Commission. Yes. And so now you have 10 minutes to respond to whatever you want to respond to. Now remember, you can also send your response in by writing, and you do have something you want to say from before. So you have 10 minutes to do that. Thank you very much.
Yes, we have much more to say. And we did not hear from the Brazilian state the expression trans children and adolescents, and that really strikes us. But we are going to answer all the questions in writing, but we still have a presentation by a specialist in the topic. So we're going to continue with that. And I now invite Numa Andrade, Doctor in Education, Luma Andrade, para speak.
Sou professora doutora.
Good afternoon, one and all. I'm the first transvestite PhD in Brazil, first teacher at that level. I'm the first researcher of transvestites and transsexual people in school, because our bodies were only thought in an environment of prostitution. I have a book published on that. I experienced it. I was expelled from my home. The family didn't want me. The school didn't want me. The church didn't want me. Society and work, jobs didn't want me. I was left with my body. I had to sell my body. I became a prostitute. This is how Brazilian children and adolescents have experienced their childhood and adolescence. According to the Association of Transvestites and Transsexuals, too many children, trans children and adolescents go through life. They need to have basic access to education, but we haven't reached elementary school yet, not to talk about middle and high school. Even in death, our bodies are rejected. We need to have our place. The children, adolescents, and adults, trans adults who are here, they are here to say enough is enough. We don't want to hear anymore that trans children and adolescents don't exist. They have always existed, and we have to know the peculiarities of such an existence. While the Brazilian Constitution and the Statute of the Child and Adolescents do not respect trans children and adolescents, there will be no safe country for such a population. Therefore, we have the duty as state, as Brazilian state, to acknowledge these people, to guarantee their basic rights, public policies that are necessary, specific legislation, so that such existence can survive in a country that kills us. Therefore, trans children do exist, they resist, and they ask for help.
Julio. Now I invite Julio Batatina, who is a doctor and a specialist on this topic.
Boa tarde, me chamo Júlio.
Good afternoon. I'm an endocrinologist, and I can say that only science can guide public policies in health. We have policies and being trans is not a diagnosis. There has been access to all of hormone therapy and all sorts of therapies for cisgender children and adolescents. 75% of this group self-mutilate and have suicidal thoughts and commit suicide because they don't have access to the right professionals. In the lab where I work, I see such children and adolescents. If there are laws or decrees, they are not implemented. Puberty blockers are only allowed in clinics and research. This gives us 400 of them in the whole in the country. As a doctor, I can only follow these children and adolescents and hope to God that they will come back alive to the next office visit. Affirmative therapies do save lives. We cannot wait for more studies and ask these adolescents to wait for this and have not access to what exists already is a violence. if affirmative therapies by science save lives, why don't they have access to such therapies?
André Brito, juiz de...
Now, André Brito, who works on the issue from the legal standpoint.
a todos.
Good afternoon. I've studied law in Rio de Janeiro, and I've been working and have had more than 15,000 trans qualifications, even some children who are under 18 years old. I just wanted to underscore that when people talk about public policies, and I don't know if this is a question for today, but we have to know what they base the policy on, because there is no research, there's no quantitative research or qualitative research for that matter on transgender children. If there isn't anything on adult transgender people, you've got much less with regards to transgender children. Now, how do we talk about violence? And I'm going to ask the top table. When we are looking at criminalization, we also have to understand we're talking about violence which is much greater than symbolic violence. This is what we call micro-violence. It's that kid that doesn't go to school without fearing, and that family that is mistreated, that's considered crazy or sick. And it's when a transvestite person asks for a taxi or an Uber and that vehicle doesn't stop for that person. Now, this micro-violence kills much more than a beating or a bullet. And, of course, when we're talking about deaths of trans people, they are violent. They are never done without pain. So trans children exist, but I would really very much to hear the state if they're doing some kind of research, some kind of quantitative and qualitative research on these children. Thank you very much.
I now invite the mother of a trans child, a trans boy.
Boa tarde a todas as pessoas.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Camila. It could be any other name, but today I'm talking on behalf of all mothers that are part of the NGO for trans. We would like to be happy when we leave our kids at school, but we're from Pernambuco, and my child in 2022, I found out that this was the state that killed most trans people in Brazil. My child has been in school for 10 years in public school, and he's 9 years in the hands of the state, and that's the time of greatest suffering for him. Now, as a trans child, our history in schools means that he went through physical violence, hostility, verbal aggression, and all of these are situations that mean that he needs controlled medication to deal with the panic that he feels when he leaves home. And amongst the aggression, he had his lunch plate thrown against him, and he was beaten by older kids, had a lot of bruises, and he had a lot of affronts by educators that asked about his identity. He also had people that looked into the restroom to look at his genitals. So Theo is a picture of millions of other trans children that are not creating happy memories in an environment that should be warm, one of learning, one of respect and safety. Theo is the victim of educators and families that allow their hate speeches to be driven in political policies which vehemently repeat and say that trans kids don't exist. There are aggressive slogans and they are intimidated. So I'm here today to affirm that, yes, Theo does exist and to ask help. So for him and all trans and teenage trans grow and have their rights and life guaranteed for happiness.
Y bien, una cosa, nosotros esperamos de la Comisión una nota.
We would like to expect from the Commission a public note or public communication saying that trans children and adolescents exist, that Brazil commit to that, and also a visit, an agenda to call on Brazil to present the specific policy for trans children. As I say, compartmentalization is a mistake. It needs to be worked on from a different vantage point. And to conclude, I'm going to give the floor to the president of the NGO that's responsible for this delegation being here.
I'm really very moved by all the things we've heard here today and everything that's been done. I'm shocked that Brazil doesn't recognize here, right here in front of me, that I'm a mother, that I represent so many different mothers, and that my daughter exists, that all other trans children exist. And this is just to say trans children exist, and you have the duty to act and protect them, because I want my child, my daughter, to come home every day. We want our adolescent trans teenagers to live for the future, that they go back home at the end of the day. And then to round it off, I'm going to ask for Luis Guilherme to say what we expect, and which hopefully very soon we can take away from this hearing today. First, I'd like to thank you for the question, and thank you also for the opportunity and your interest to hear us, teenagers and trans children. I'm going to try and be as brief as possible, even though this is a very long, extensive issue. I don't have an extensive answer right now, but if you recognize that we do exist, that we're here, I need my word to be taken seriously. I need it to be that when I go to school, I can use my social name. I'm an exception in my family. My entire family supports me. I have backing. Most of these children do not have that, and I want these children to not depend on their parents to have their name accepted, to go to the bathroom that they identify with. These are basic things. These are basic needs. All human beings need these things, and they're denied. They're denied because most people do not believe that we exist. Well, yes, we do. We do exist. We need public policies. And even if the state said that there are policies for LGBTQ plus and adults, but as others say, I didn't hear the word adolescent or teenager or child, not once, not even once. Now, that is horrific and it's deplorable. This is very painful for me. It's really horrific that you don't recognize my existence, that you're not willing to put together public policies that can guarantee the least amount of rights. And this is what we want. We want rights. We want policies. We want your word. Thank you very much.
Society to the state. Well, 13 minutes. 13 minutes.
Ok, muito obrigado.
Thank you very much for your questions that were addressed to the state. Well, many of them require, of course, a longer, detailed answer, and we would be very happy to send them in to all of you. That said, I would like to say that the Brazilian state is crafting its public policies in the area of human rights, and various of these require extensive consultation, not just in the various agencies of the Brazilian state, but also with civil society. Many of the councils that are going to be different have already been set up, even when it comes to the policies that have to do with health. People spoke about compartmentalization, but it does take into account the concerns of other areas in the government and civil society as well, with your active participation as we put together these public policies. Today, the Brazilian state is committed to human rights. We are committed to make progress in this agenda of diversity and respect, safety, a welcoming, warm welcome in the area of education and health, and in all of the other areas of the Brazilian state, as well as what somebody already mentioned, human rights when it comes to police, when it comes to the judiciary. And we also have to bear in mind the gender identity of people. In other words, there's no problem in dealing with diversity of all people, even children and teenagers like this, and to respect their gender identity. what it is that we do have to build this policy. We have to scaffold this. And there's a whole background. There were some backsteps, but now we need to get it right. We have to get it right so that we can hear the society. Somebody also mentioned culture. Now, there is a big challenge, and that is to improve the legal issue, the legal frameworks. But based on the legal frameworks, we have to do some additional, we have to make concerted efforts. It's not just on the shoulders of the state. The state has to also engage the society and to provide a debate that is informed by these public policies and not make mistakes, because in some areas we can't make mistakes, especially when you're talking about children and adolescents. I think that everybody here is way aware that there were a lot of mistakes. Brazil is a violent country. It's a country that does have big problems when it comes to human rights, and we recognize that. It is not by chance that we're here in this process, in this public hearing. We believe things, and this was said by a person from civil society, this call, this cry to be heard. Believe me, you are being heard. We have taken due note of each comment. It's not up to us as a delegation to take any decision right now and to give all the replies that exist. It's really very complex for the Brazilian state. As on the municipal or city level, Brazil is a federation, so we really have to come together and look at all the sub-national areas. These people are also responsible for implementing a lot of these policies, many of the policies, in fact, in education, for example. We have big guidelines which are provided by the federal government, general guidelines for education, but implementation also depends on the engagement and involvement of the state. So it's a big alliance for human rights that has to be put together to respect diversity, to respect gender identity, so as to have a welcoming environment in all arenas, in education, in health, and in all spheres where there is some contact with the citizenry. And children and adolescents have a priority. They are a priority in all of this. They have rights, as we said initially, and they have to be heard. And that's why we value every single word that was said by these children and adolescents and by the adults who represent interests that are legitimate and with which we share a view. I cannot give you a final answer right now because, as I said, it depends on an entire process. But we are going to go back and take to Brasilia, to the competent authorities, and to provide more detailed answers for each and every one of you. There is a concern with the intersectionality, as was mentioned. This was another concern, but we do believe that discrimination is cumulative. Gender, issues of identity, gender identity, also for Afro-descendants or blacks and indigenous people and those with disabilities. Well, all of these things are factors that pile up. They pile up and they affect a person's life, particularly if people have to go through barriers on their rights and discrimination. So it's really very difficult. The Commission has a very vast experience in analyzing different countries, but the difficulty of crafting public policies that carry that we have to bear in mind is intersectionality is also very important, and the federal government has borne these things in mind and is present in various areas, some with more progress than others. And then finally, we would like to underscore that this exercise is not a procedural exercise. We have experienced, the Brazilian state has experienced, and based on the recommendation of the Commission, we can make legal changes in public policies that underscore and have made enormous progress. So the fact that the Brazilian state is here, listening to you, hearing you, is big progress in and of itself, because in the past we had a different position, and that was to deny the importance of this exercise, and we don't deny it now. So please don't feel that you are overlooked or looked at askance by the Brazilian state. No, we're here. We're listening to you. This is going to have consequences, and I hope that this will be very positive when it comes to progress in human rights and gender identity and intersectionality and all the other demands that you have with regards to this issue. Let me just give you a specific example. The Mariana Peña law. This was a real big step forward, progress in the fight against violence against women. And it emerged from a recommendation from the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and other major steps too, giant steps in terms of the ruling of the Inter-American Court, which was implemented by the Brazilian state. So I think that this is the message that we can take away. We can leave this with you. It's difficult in 10 minutes or less to give you an answer which satisfies the Brazilian state and its position. We're talking about blacks in Brazil. For the last 200 years, there's structural racism when it comes to gender and gender identity or identity. These are issues that require concerted efforts over time, not just in public policies. Somebody mentioned the cultural issue. This question is much more complicated because many of the challenges that we have are micro-violence now, micro-violence, microaggression, that is to say, and oftentimes they don't crop up in the statistics. They're much more grave than they appear in the statistics, and this is a problem that can only be ironed out with an alliance with civil society, a dialogue with civil society. What are the institutions? Some people mention some religious institutions, but we can also talk about philanthropic institutions, educational institutions, and other academic or think tanks. The medical profession, they were present here, and I truly value the contribution that they offered. They gave a scientific contribution, which is really very important, and oftentimes there's not a consensus, neither in the medical community on various issues, and we saw that during the pandemic, for example, so that we really have to make an effort with these other organizations, these corporations, and make them much more open to diversity, to human rights, right? Because here we have two representatives who are committed to that, but I really can't say that that's a general rule across the board all the time. So that this is an issue which is one of human rights that has to be taken as an issue that covers all of social society in alliance with the state and everybody that's committed to make the Brazilian be seen as a society for everybody. We will all gain by having a more democratic, open, and inclusive society. And this is a process of convincing, overcoming, as a matter of fact, some of these structural issues that have been around forever, from some time immemorial that we have in Brazil. So I think that slowly but surely, little by little, we're going to move in that direction. I think that this event here, this public hearing, is a hallmark in this regard because it's going to call for decisions from the Brazilian state in terms of coming up with answers to a legitimate aspiration that has been expressed here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So it's left just for me to close, and I do want to recognize one of the last statements you made, words, but it really is about all of us living in that better world that you asked for. So I want to end by really recognizing Agatha, Celeste, Apollo, and Luis for your contribution here, and of course the organization, I have to get it right, it's at Mina Kriyanka Trans, and the parents who are here who are also advocates for equality and for the children, and all of the experts who have so much to contribute to shape the policy. And I just want to end by saying I really hear when the children and adolescents say, "Call me by my name." It's one thing to say everybody has rights, but recognize that trans children exist, trans adolescents exist, and they want that recognition. They want the words of that, because the words are symbolic, but the words are also profound and fundamental. So thank you very much, everyone. And I now going to ring the bell to bring the hearing to an end. Yeah. Huh? Yes, it was, huh?